Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, you watched the Super Bowl, I'm sure.
Well, I'm a little deflated this morning after the 49ers came up just short in a game they probably should have won. It's a third Super Bowl in a row where they had a really good chance to win and didn't. But, I think there's no question Kansas City was probably the better team on the field yesterday. So I think you can hang your heads high for a valiant effort. But yes, it was not a super enjoyable way to end the day. I did eat well, so that was one good thing, but not a great game. And the end of the game certainly was not great in my book.
Well, I confessed I didn't watch the Super Bowl. I took advantage of the quiet afternoon to Uber back to Pasadena from my mom's and had an early dinner with a friend who also doesn't watch the Super Bowl. You know, Tim, I have to say over the last few years, the NFL and a lot of other sports enterprises have really turned me off because of all of the politicization. And more and more, I even ignore the halftime and entertainment because it just looks like some massive drill team on steroids and the techno stuff. At some point of this week, I will check out the commercials. I'm a marketer by training, so I would love to see some of those clever ads. And I think it better reveals, the temperature of the times when you start to look at those ads and what people are interested in, what people care about. But no, I didn't watch it. And in fact, this morning, that was the first time I learned who won when I saw this big smooch from Taylor Swift to some Kansas City player, Travis something or other.
Travis Kelce, yes. That's been an interesting debate, with the Super Bowl. And, as with everything, right, it becomes politicized. There's been a lot of people complaining about there's too much coverage of Taylor Swift and the whole saga of would she make it back from her concert in Japan in time to see her boyfriend in the Super Bowl, which, well, when you have an emission-spewing private jet, of course you would make it back in time because the plane flies at your schedule. I'm not a big fan of the boycott sort of things and the complaints about Taylor Swift because what does Taylor Swift do for the NFL? She's the biggest star in the world, undeniably. And they say the expectation is this will probably be the most watched Super Bowl in history, largely due to Taylor Swift. So, if she, and I thought it was very interesting. I listened to an interview the other day with Jim Nantz, who's the great announcer for CBS, and the dominant topic in the pre-interviews with all of these different commentators was not the game, it was Taylor Swift. And he said, you know what, for all the talk of we're too obsessed with her, they in the AFC Championship game showed her on the screen cumulatively 43 seconds out of a 3.5-hour game. But it would make you think from all the coverage, right, that they literally had a camera on her the entire game. She certainly did not disappoint. They did not disappoint for the camera yesterday, but it was great to see. Really, we could focus on the game and not all the other extraneous things. But, what else do you expect? It was a Super Bowl in Las Vegas. So if you're not going to get the lights and dazzle there, where are you ever going to get it?
Well, in addition to the 49ers loss, we should talk also about another downer, Tim, which is the potentially growing California budget deficit. So back in December, the nonpartisan legislative analyst office forecasted a $68 billion deficit. And then in January, Newsom said it was more like $38 billion. Well, now, as tax collections are coming in, apparently very weak, says the LAO. So if you compare December 22 tax receipts with the current or this just past December, the government is collecting about 1/3 less. So that's a pretty big change.
That's right. And as we covered when the governor announced his budget proposal, the governor chose to sort of pick a fight with the legislative analyst. Well, I think they, in a nice kind of quiet way, have gotten their revenge on that. And they put out their latest revenue projection of the big three revenues, and the big three revenues are personal income tax, sales tax, and corporate income tax. Their argument is that now remember, we kind of look at a budget in a 3-year period. So over the 3-year budget period, they project that because of weak cash collection in December and January, they project now that revenue is about $24 billion over what is projected in the governor's budget for that 3-year period from 2022-23 to 2024-25. And specifically in this budget year, 2023-24, $15.3 billion less. So, they note that there is a significant amount of uncertainty, of course, and things could be better than they project, but things could be even worse than they project. But the key thing is that even with the ink still, I don't know that you would say the ink is dry on the governor's plan yet. It's bleeding even from that just happened a month ago. So it's a further sign that legislators need to get serious about the budget, and the faster they make real spending reductions and real budget changes that are going to save the state money, the better we're going to be off in the long run. And it seems, unfortunately, from Newsom on down, they're more focused on kind of temporary kick the can down the road solutions that may put us in an even more precarious fiscal situation next year.
So, Tim, you're also following this ballot measure that would raise the threshold for passing new state and local taxes by the legislature and local governments. So the California Business Roundtable and the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association sponsored this initiative, and it would, first of all, require voter approval for all taxes passed in Sacramento, and then it would also impose a 2/3 voter requirement on local taxes. Recently, there have been ads taken out by certain interest groups that are shaming those companies that are part of the roundtable and those in the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. So what do you think about that?
It's pretty troubling, actually. You're basically kind of engaging in, naming and shaming, when in this case, it is not a shame to be standing up for making it harder to raise taxes and keeping spending under control. And what it is it's the spending lobby and the allies of the governor and the liberal leaders in the legislature who want to be able to tax and spend as much as they want. And they don't want to have a voter check on their power, because keep in mind, the only check on the power of the legislature these days and the governor is the initiative process. So they have been doing everything they can in recent months to add a whole bunch of requirements to the initiative process and to try to change things up, to try and confuse voters or to try to make it harder to go around the legislature. And this is one where Howard Jarvis and the Business Roundtable, they went around the legislature and they basically asserted the right of the people. And so that's the issue here, is that they don't like this initiative. And so they are basically engaging in a kind of thuggery by people who, if a business isn't going to fight higher taxes, well, what are they going to do? And so I think it's really, it's a pretty bad look. And if they do and succeed on this issue, well, what other issue are they going to try this out on where they could silence dissent? It's a pretty chilling effort by them. Hopefully it will fail. I think they know, and they're running scared, that even in a presidential election year with high Democratic turnout, this measure is likely going to pass, because when given the choice, voters want to keep their taxes low. And historically, over the years, even as California has gotten increasingly blue, the voters have made clear that they don't want to make it easier to raise taxes, and they want to keep their taxes low in California. I think it's kind of a last-ditch effort to try to avoid having this ballot fight from their perspective. They're also trying a whole bunch of legal challenges to keep it off the ballot. It's pretty chilling when you read this. And when you think about what PRI and other free market think tanks have gone through with the fights that we had, that we wanted the Supreme Court over donor privacy, it's the same kind of thing. It's a really chilling intimidation of people exercising their free speech rights by those in power. And I think we should all be very concerned about that.
Well, let's hope that companies don't cave to the pressure. And it used to be that companies would be part of these associations and roundtables so that they could look after their interest in either state or the federal government and go about their business of selling products or services. They've used this traditional way of working with Congress or the legislature in trying to lobby for their various concerns and interests. But now this changes the scale of things, Tim. So you're right. It is very, very disturbing. So finally, here we're for the most part, we still all come into the office. But every time I go to DC, it looks like so many of the office buildings are empty, and they're actually even kind of falling apart, if you ask me. So I looked this up the other day. 68% of federal workers are telecommuting. Compare that to about 40% pre-pandemic. So we've got a similar issue among state workers, apparently. So managers are trying to get employees back into the office, but it's been like pulling teeth.
And only 2 days a week. That's the other thing is that obviously, and we've covered at PRI, there is this big debate that was accelerated by the pandemic on the future of work and whether gig work and working at home and telecommuting and all those sorts of things are going to become increasingly the way people work. And I think there's no question that we will. But for now, and especially when you're considering state work, well, state bureaucrats don't want to be in the office because they don't want to be available and held accountable by the people. And so they want to be able to kind of hide working at home in their pajamas. There was a big story in the Sacramento Bee about this the other day. And the kind of interesting thing about it is the people they profile, there's one fellow who works for the EPA, and it says he used to chug in from Elk Grove every day to the EPA's headquarters is a few blocks from PRI's office here in downtown Sacramento. Well, he moved to Midtown. He can bike to work or walk to work. So I don't understand what his complaint would be actually having to work in the office. But I think kind of your typical bureaucrat became, they like working in their pajamas at home and they don't want to actually have to put on pants and come to work. It's understandable. Now, are there issues of productivity? I think most of the anecdotes is that people were pretty productive working at home. But, especially if you're a public servant, you should have to come in the office and face other state agencies or legislators or members of the public. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for these folks. We come in the office every day. Yes, we functioned just fine at home during the pandemic, but you got to get out in the world and be around people. And, we have so much creative thinking comes not on a Zoom call, but when you're in an office face-to-face brainstorming. You can mentor people when you're actually in an office face-to-face. Quality control happens when you're in an office face-to-face. And so you just don't get that at home on a Zoom call. And, we've all been on it, right? You tune out boring Zoom calls. So are you really getting, the company message and really participating when you're at home with your camera off and your microphone off doing Zoom meetings? So, and the other thing too, of course, is the economy. Sacramento's downtown economy, the lunch business, the other shop, they're closing right and left. We just lost Chicory, which was the famous coffee shop across the street from the state capitol. The See's Candy that was across the street from the state capitol that was always doing a booming business. Businesses like these and institutional restaurants that did a lot of lunch businesses, they closed because people aren't around to go to lunch. So it's so important for the economy and just for having an accountable government that state workers actually need to come in and be in the office.
Tim, I wonder if this will come back to bite them because, look, we've just talked about the deficit as a manager, out of sight, out of mind. If I don't see you in the office all the time reminding me of all the great work you're doing, well, when I have to make cuts, well, maybe I'll think twice. What's, Joe Schmo doing these days? And if I haven't seen him and not quite certain about his productivity, I might want to think, well, maybe he's a fellow that we actually don't need after all. If I've got to make cuts in the budget place in the next 5 to 10 years, and if they're not at work, well, they could be facing losing a job.
And there is something to be said for we could take underutilized office buildings and convert them into housing, but that is an incredibly complex task to do that with plumbing and, structural issues in the buildings. There's a proposal going on right now that I believe 3 of the downtown state office buildings, they want to transition into housing. It really is easier said than done, but that certainly is a conversation we can have. And we can have a conversation about if there are new office buildings on the drawing board, well, maybe we shouldn't build those right now. But that's very different from, hey, you folks sitting at home working in your pajamas, you need to actually come into work. So, for fans of Milton Friedman, we have a terrific guest this week. We have Jennifer Burns, who is a historian at Stanford University, and she has written a really definitive biography of Milton Friedman called Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. And if you're interested in learning more about his life story and how Milton Friedman got to be Milton Friedman, this is the book for you. You know, Milton Friedman played an important role. Milton and Rose played an important role in the history of PRI over the years, and they were both important mentors for our Sally Pipes. And so as PRI celebrates its 45th anniversary this year, we thought it was only fitting that we had Jennifer on to talk about someone who played such an important role in PRI's work over the years.
Tim, so I think this is a very, very important book because after Milton passed and some of the great economists, post-war economists who were for advanced classical liberalism or free markets, well, they're starting to leave this earth. And we don't necessarily have big stars replacing them. And with all this talk of more and more about collectivism and less about free markets, we really need to have the memory of Milton Friedman and those great economists. We really need to get them back to the conversation and championing their great ideas. So I think this is going to be a very important book, and I'm glad we had her.
And it's a terrific interview. I think all of you, if you're at all interested in certainly a good book, but learning about a great American, this is the interview for you.
Thanks very much for listening. Jennifer, we're so pleased to have you on Next Round to talk about your new book on Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. PRI is celebrating its 45th anniversary this year, and Milton and Rose Friedman played a huge role in our work over the years, and they were both mentors for our CEO, Sally Pipes. So for those who may not be familiar with you and your work, tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you interested in writing a major biography of one of the most influential economists in American history.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. And it's always great when there's a personal connection to the topic. So I'm a historian, and my specialty is 20th century United States. And within that, I'm really interested in history of ideas and also ideas in politics and kind of how those different spaces come together. And the first book that I wrote, which was actually my doctoral dissertation, was a biography of Ayn Rand, the libertarian novelist and philosopher, and was such a great study, sort of case study of how this, very creative thinker and artist and writer, created these ideas that were very important to her. And then I really enjoyed kind of seeing who found them, what they made of the various, ideas she had, whether it was the organized objectivist movement or more traditional conservatives who kind of incorporated her ideas into their economic thinking, or just young people who had a whole new world open to them through the works of Ayn Rand. And so that kind of got me started going in one direction. And I was thinking of writing kind of a broader history of conservative ideas. And I was particularly interested in economic ideas. And I came across Milton Friedman, and I thought, well, okay, I'll kind of read up on Friedman. There's got to be, a book I can read to learn all about him. And there really wasn't. I mean, there's some biographies out there for sure. They tend to be a little shorter or kind of focused on one particular topic. And there wasn't really a soup to nuts historical biography. But I knew Friedman's papers were very well preserved. This was around the time I was coming to Stanford from a first job at University of Virginia. And so I knew I had this whole archive at my fingertips. And the thing is, when I started, I was really more interested in Friedman, the public figure. And I got really drawn into the economics and the history of economics. And so that was really an unexpected kind of delight of researching the book.
So in the introduction to your book, you note that you struggled with the book's subtitle, The Last Conservative. And as you note, Friedman himself would probably label himself, a liberal, certainly in the classical sense. So explain your thinking here with The Last Conservative as your subtitle.
Yeah, there's kind of two ways that I think of Friedman as a conservative. And one of them is just thinking about him as an economist, because what I came to realize is that for most of his career, Milton Friedman was really out of step with the intellectual currents and fashions in the field of economics. And so when he was just entering the profession, the field was becoming increasingly quantitative and mathematical and moving towards kind of abstract top-down models of how the economy worked. And Friedman had the education and the training and the quantitative skills to do this type of economics, but he really deliberately chose not to. And instead, he based, his major research endeavor with Anna Schwartz on the quantity theory of money, which was an older idea that many economists said it doesn't really apply in today's world. And the research that he did was methodologically very old-fashioned, counting up the literal amount of money in circulation, really looking at big bodies of data and trying to develop theories out of that, rather than doing more mathematically sophisticated or mathematical or statistical analysis. So if a conservative is someone who conserves, what Friedman really did was conserve these older approaches to economics across the 20th century by incorporating them into his thinking and kind of refreshing and revitalizing them. And secondly, although, Friedman, when press would say, well, I'm a classical liberal, he was very comfortable with and worked closely with many figures in American politics who called themselves conservative. So, he never, he made an alliance with this group. And again, in American culture, it's really hard. The word liberal, I think this is changing a bit, but the word liberal has become very associated with Democratic Party liberalism or New Deal liberalism. And so in a book that's trying to invite a broad readership into the story of Milton Friedman and his legacy, I felt like, it was going to just simply be confusing to talk about him as a liberal. So those are kind of the two reasons, I think philosophical and then maybe more just pragmatic.
So when students take economics, their eyes often glaze over struggling to keep up what could be pretty dry material. I was an econ major, so I always liked economics. But Milton Friedman became an unlikely star in the academic world and beyond. Looking back on his life's work in your book, what do you think explains his broad appeal?
Well, there's a couple of parts to it. One is that, because Friedman was doing a different type of economics, a kind of older style of economics, he was using kind of methods and approaches that are more understandable. So narrative. In other words, he and Anna Schwartz wrote a story of the history of money in the United States rather than, and it had a theory embedded in it, but it really was a story and a narrative. And then he was just very well spoken for an economist. He was quick on his feet. He was witty. He enjoyed debate. And so he was able to, go on a television show or write a newspaper column that was, kind of boiled things down to the essence. And then, he had undergirding all of his economics, this, what I talk about as a philosophy of freedom, a very clear idea that individual freedom, individual initiative, individual rights, these should be, in his view, the kind of grounding of society, and they were really the grounding of his thought. So it was an integrated worldview, and he could translate it into these terms of freedom and individualism that really resonate with American political culture. So I think that was another reason for his success.
So Friedman grew up in New Jersey as the son of Jewish immigrants, and he spent his formative years thinking about and developing his economic philosophy and policies during the time of the Great Depression and the New Deal, and culminating in his time at the University of Chicago. So share with our listeners a little bit about Friedman's early years and the important work that he did way back in the 1930s, particularly at Chicago. How did Milton Friedman become Milton Friedman?
Yeah, it's a long path, but one of the things I argue in the book is that the kind of fundamentals of his thinking were set very early, and they were really set in the 1930s at the University of Chicago. He grew up in a Jewish immigrant family. It was, his parents didn't have a high level of wealth, but they, made a living. They were able to, move to a small town where he had excellent public education. Then he went to Rutgers. And then he went on to the University of Chicago, arriving in 1932, close to the worst year of the Great Depression. And what was distinctive is when he got to Chicago, he found, first of all, his professors were very active in calling for government intervention on an emergency basis to help people who were suffering through this huge economic collapse. He also imbibed the kind of Chicago view that the Great Depression was related to the banking system, to money and finance. And that was kind of the lens to look at it through, that it wasn't a broader collapse in capitalism. And in the 1930s, that idea was widespread. This was the sort of communist idea that eventually capitalism would come into a crisis and that would be the end of it. And so, Friedman always had maybe a more narrow perspective that this was a business cycle gone wrong because it got into the banking system. And so when a few years later, a lot of economists were finding themselves drawn to the theories of John Maynard Keynes, one reason they were drawn to those theories is because they seemed to explain the Great Depression. They didn't have an explanation for it. But Friedman felt like he already had a handle on it based on his Chicago education and based on the fact he was just a little bit older than the great bulk of economists who would emerge as leading Keynesians. And so he kind of got this early Chicago interpretation when many economists of his generation, just a few years later, would get the Keynesian interpretation at a very formative moment. So I spent a lot of time on the early Chicago, and I was just so fascinated by it. It was a really interesting cast of characters. I traced them in Room 7. The Room 7 gang was a kind of a storeroom where they would hang out. And what's also interesting is that many of these people, men like Aaron Director, George Stigler, or even Rose Friedman, they were his lifelong companions. And these were the people he met, at the University of Chicago. So it really was truly formative.
So Friedman is naturally compared to the other major American economic force of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, as you mentioned. Talk about the impact that Keynes' work had on influencing Friedman's outlook and philosophy, especially his question of Keynesian theory, to which you devote really a long chapter or two in the book.
Yeah, so we have to draw a couple of distinctions around this question. So one is that Friedman really admired Keynes as an economist, kind of thinking about the bulk of his work. But he did not, as I said, sort of convert to the ideas in the general theory about what had caused the Great Depression and how to remedy it. And in part, that was because he had a monetary interpretation, and in part because the Keynesian interpretation, especially as it was taken up in the United States, was very much linked to an expansion in the federal government's roles and responsibilities. And while Friedman and his professors had been supportive of kind of emergency relief, and he really would always be concerned about poverty and inequality and how those could be addressed, he didn't support a kind of fundamental overhaul of what is the role of government in society. And he really believed that it was private initiative and private economic action that was the driver of prosperity. And the Keynesian interpretation was coming a little closer to, well, it's this taxing and spending priorities of the federal government that are really what keeps capitalism on a stable growth path. And that's really what we need to focus on. So he was sort of economically and philosophically opposed to that conclusion. And one reason I, talk about this in some depth in the book is because there's been kind of a myth out there that Friedman was a Keynesian who then kind of converted to a different point of view. And I just didn't really find any evidence for this in the book. What I did find is that in an emergency situation, say the Great Depression or say World War II, he thought differently and he approached economics differently. And he considered that completely appropriate, that there were policies he might support in wartime that didn't mean he would support them in peacetime. And so I think previous scholars have kind of over-focused on what he was thinking and doing during World War II. But, Friedman made very clear, like, this is an emergency. This is no ordinary time. And what I'm advocating for now doesn't mean I would advocate this if we weren't, in this life or death struggle. So I really wanted to clarify that. And I think as time went on, Friedman dedicated much of his intellectual work to creating an alternative worldview and an alternative interpretation of economics from American Keynesianism as it developed. And so that's really a thread I follow definitely throughout the book.
So Friedman, of course, is known, as you say, for developing and advancing monetarism and price theory and a full-throated embrace of free market capitalism. But as one of your chapter titles suggests, he really was a political economist. And it seems like this, for lack of a better term, political acumen is what really set him apart from other economists, with his forging of strong relationships with figures like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and other conservative heavyweights, and his really taking an active role in the conservative movement. So based on your research, why do you think he has been so influential for generations, even today, in educating and gaining devoted followers to his theories among politicians and those running the economy? Is it more his ability to generate good relationships with politicians and others, or was it really the clarity and relatability of his philosophy, or was it something else?
So, I think it's a couple different things. As I've mentioned, he was very good at expressing complicated ideas. He always linked those ideas back to a political philosophy of freedom and individualism. So if he found a politician who he felt shared those values, he then would be able to explain really quickly how a sort of maybe seemingly technical economic policy related back to that question of freedom. And so one example of this is with international relations, and he really he lived in a world in which international finance and exchange rates and the movement of capital was much more restricted than it is now. And he really believed this was an issue of freedom. Your ability to take your capital out of one country and bring it to another was a fundamental issue of freedom, not of economic policy. But at the same time, he could reassure his listener, if you loosen these capital controls, it's not going to create an economic collapse. So I think being able to go back and forth to those things, on those different levels, was really important. But then I've also seen that Friedman was able to be pragmatic. He was able to join hands with someone who would advance his policies and just kind of be a little quiet about the ones he didn't agree with. So, this was definitely in contradiction to Ayn Rand. If Ayn Rand thought you had something wrong, she would kind of blare it from the treetops. Whereas, Friedman was very quietly pro-choice, and he didn't make an issue of it as that became, as being pro-life became increasingly important in Republican politics, but he stuck by his beliefs. And, another example of this would be his opposition to the draft. And he was very skillful at bringing together a coalition of, conservatives, liberals, military people, policymakers, and having them think through what seemed unthinkable, that's ending the draft. But he did it without really engaging the question of the war in Vietnam, which was incredibly controversial. So he had, I think, a discipline and a focus and just a pragmatism about how he interacted in the political realm. And he understood sort of what his lane was and what he could contribute. And then he was always able to use that economic expertise in the service of a larger goal, a moral and political goal that he supported.
Milton Friedman was a Nobel laureate and has been hugely influential to generations of economists. But through his book and later TV program, Free to Choose, he was arguably the most influential economist in teaching Main Street folks without much of an economic background about free markets and liberty. He even gained celebrity followers like Tim's former boss, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, during the height of his Hollywood career. So if you could explain the influence and lasting popularity of Free to Choose, which, as you write, Friedman was initially not interested in doing. And in your view, what explains his appeal as an economist to regular Americans?
So, Friedman was able to communicate these complicated ideas in very simple ways. And so I think he was just a great teacher. And in his public appearances, he was sort of acting as a teacher to the uninitiated. That's part of it. Part of it is that, like I said, he was able to bring these more arcane issues back to a kind of philosophical basis and show how they really mattered. He had great aphorisms, that people could easily grasp. So one of his more influential ones was inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And that kind of boiled down this really complicated economic issue into a way that people could understand. It's something having to do with money and how it circulates in the economy. In terms of Free to Choose, it's really interesting to watch it today. This is a program where Friedman sat down. First of all, he did a shoot in an area, maybe he traveled somewhere and he kind of did a deep dive on one particular economic issue. And the second half of the show, he sat down at the University of Chicago with a group of people, some of whom agreed with him, some of whom didn't, and had a really, live, unfiltered, unscripted debate. And this whole series didn't really talk down to people. It brought them into his thinking. It showed people disagreeing. And so at that era, it made for good TV, in the 1980s. And now we have different standards, but I still have people who say, I watch Free to Choose on YouTube and it's really amazing. Look, he's disagreeing politely with his opponents, and his opponents are engaging his arguments and, not making an ad hominem attack. So as time goes on, I sort of think Free to Choose had something really essentially valuable about it, which was sort of showing ideas in action and showing intellectual debate in action. Now, of course, the timing of Free to Choose was also really important because it came out in 1980 during Reagan's presidential campaign, in which Ronald Reagan was saying many things that resonated with Friedman. Essentially, we have to take a different approach to the economy. We have to take a different approach to government, and it's going to get us out of this doldrums we've fallen into. And, Friedman was making many of the same arguments in more detail. So I think people were also drawn to the show because it seemed a sort of preview of what they might get in a Reagan administration.
So as you document in the book, women played an important role in Friedman's life, particularly his economist and co-author, Anna Schwartz, but perhaps the most influential woman in Friedman's life and work was his beloved wife, Rose. So share with our listeners some insight on the key role that Rose Friedman played in his work throughout his career.
Yeah, so, there's a many different places that Rose appears, and some of them, are already well known. So, for example, his first book, Capitalism and Freedom, that was aimed at a general audience, it's with the assistance of Rose D. Friedman, and she really helped put that book together. Then she's listed as a full co-author on Free to Choose, the book that came out of the TV series. What listeners might not know is she also really encouraged Milton to do both his Newsweek column, which gave him a public profile, and then the actual Free to Choose television series. And in both cases, she would work with him. If he was, I'm not sure what I should write about, she'd say, well, let's brainstorm some ideas. Or with Free to Choose, they would literally practice his lines off camera. So Rose really, I think, helped encourage him and support him to become a public figure. And I don't know that he would have achieved that level of fame without her. So some of my answer to these other questions you'd asking should have just been, Rose Friedman. One thing I document in the book that really hasn't been known before is how pivotal she was to one of his most important economic ideas, which was the theory of the consumption function. And this is a book published in 1957. It's still ideas that are influential in economics today. And Friedman, this book came out of conversations between Rose Friedman and a bunch of her friends who were also economists, these women economists who worked on consumption data. And they would come and visit her in the summer, and they would stay up late talking economics, and Milton Friedman would get in on the conversation. And over the years, this led to a really new approach to consumption data that Friedman would eventually publish. And so Rose was absolutely pivotal to that. And that was one of the three pieces of his research that was cited in the Nobel Prize citation. So this was really, really important work. So, Rose was there every step of the way. And in the book, I try to, refresh on some of the ones that are already known, and then also bring the reader into these unknown aspects of their relationship as well.
So, Jennifer, as we close, how, in your view, will historians 100 years from now remember Milton Friedman? Based on a hugely influential life well lived, what do you think he will be most remembered for?
So I think Friedman will, in terms of the contribution of his thought, his framing of the Great Depression as a monetary crisis is just been foundational, and other economists have added to it, but it's still really the starting point. So I think ideally he would be remembered as someone who along with Anna Schwartz, helped explain how to prevent major depressions, how to prevent a downturn in the business cycle from becoming a major crisis. And I think it's to their credit that we haven't seen an event on the scale of the Great Depression ever since. That would be what I would hope. I think he may be more likely to be remembered in the popular imagination, though, kind of is how we think about Adam Smith or John Maynard Keynes, these names that represent a certain way of thinking about the economy, about our society. And in Friedman's case, it's the revitalization of free markets and the recognition of what capitalism can do for restoring, mature industrial economies to growth and productivity, and also for having a beacon for many of the countries that came out of the Soviet sphere and looked to his ideas as kind of the path forward. So I think he'll come to represent a whole constellation of ideas that really define the latter part of the 20th century.
Finally, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing politics and policy over a great glass of California wine. So what wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying to celebrate the publication of your terrific new book?
Well, it's interesting. I actually am a teetotaler. I don't drink alcohol, but I was recently in Great Britain and I was introduced to something called Jukes, which is a distilled, it's made by a sommelier to kind of imitate the taste of wine. And it's a distilled, some type of distilled spirit, non-alcoholic though, maybe it's berry based, and you drop it into fizzy water and you get what tastes a lot like a rosé. So yeah, that's something I enjoyed. I was kind of doing a book tour over in England and I enjoyed that as part of it. So that would be my, that's my plug. And I don't know if it's available in the United States. So maybe we can develop a following for it.
Great. Thanks so much. I'll have to try it when I'm in the UK. Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.